Welcome to Roadmaps and Roadblocks. I'm Beth Osborne, Interim President and CEO of Smart Growth America.
And I'm Martha Ruskowski of the Funders Network. We created this series to provide bite-sized information and stories about how the federal program that supports highways, transit, passenger rail, active transportation got to be the way it is, and to talk about how we can make it better. This series is for anyone who thinks that we deserve a safer, saner, more sustainable transportation system that gets people to where they need to go. We hope to illustrate what's working, what isn't, and talk about how we can change it.
So let's get to our special guest. Today, we're going to talk to Nick Sifuentes. He's currently serving as the program director at the Summit Foundation, one of the key investors in transportation advocacy, particularly through the Clean Rides Network. He also put in time at the Energy Foundation and served as the executive director at the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. We invited Nick for a conversation about how funders and advocates should be thinking about the opportunities and challenges of this next federal surface transportation reauthorization. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Before we get rolling, do you want to talk a little bit about your work right now and particularly your work on the Clean Rides Network?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. Summit Foundation, alongside a couple of other partner foundations, Transit Center, the McKnight Foundation, Energy Foundation, back in September 2023, started talking about, hey, what would it take to really start to reform transportation, federally and in states in meaningful ways? And so we brought together a bunch of NGOs at McKnight's headquarters in Minneapolis to start asking the question, what does it take? What does reform actually look like? How can we start to meet our climate goals in transportation? How can we reduce the burden that transportation plays in people's monthly budgets all across America? And how can we make a transportation system that actually meets people's needs rather than forces sprawl and long commutes and being far from anything you want to be next to on most Americans? And the answer ended up being, hey, let's look at the way that state departments of transportation do business. And the fortunate thing about that moment was this is back in 2023, and we said, okay, what does this look like, and how can we create something that interplays with federal transportation reauthorization, but also has a life of its own? And then fast forward to now, and we have over 100 groups, both big national climate groups and small local grassroots organizations, and everywhere in between, in 7 states working on clean rides, which is what we eventually arrived at. The Clean Rides Network is the name for this network of NGOs and CBOs, community-based organizations, that are really focused on what does it take to transform state departments of transportation away from business as usual, asphalt everywhere, sprawl everywhere, to building actual transportation, and then the kind of housing and land use that Americans actually want and need. And I'm really excited about the work. We're fundraising for it now while the doing is happening. So we're building the train, at the same time that we're riding it. But knock on wood, so far I think we're seeing some exciting early steps.
Yeah, the state level work is really exciting and seems to be very strategic right now because they get a lot of federal money, they have state money, they operate with a lot of autonomy, not a lot of transparency. So the Clean Rides work is really exciting. For this series, we're focusing on the federal piece, including that federal money that goes from Washington out to the states. So, Nick, in that frame, what about the federal transportation funding approach is working?
What is good is that the federal dollars that come into states augment states' own budgets and dollars, what's available from state and local sources to provide the kind of funding we need to continue to build a transportation network. Notice that is faint praise. Great, there's money. That is about the best thing that I can say at this point about federal reauthorization, because there's a bunch of challenges, right? Reauthorization is not playing out on the right time scales. They're always delayed. It leaves states a little bit in limbo. The program is consistently changing in, small but sometimes significant ways that can leave states sometimes and agencies, et cetera, sometimes guessing as to what the next iteration of the program is going to look like. And it ends up being a bit of a political football. And so you have, sometimes significant swings. And I think we're going to see yet another potential significant swing based on who's in power and what priorities they have, rather than just saying, what transportation benefits from a sense of financial stability. That doesn't seem to be the operating principle. And then you get into the problem of the program itself, which is, when you start digging into transportation spending, you've got a lot of dollars that are doing the heavy lifting on the transit and the active mobility side that are dated, that require complex application processes that not a lot of folks have time or wherewithal to do. Um, and the problem that you run into is that as of right dollars get spent on things that aren't necessarily the most beneficial things that Americans actually want to see. And then the things that could be most helpful, well, you better hope that your state or your local transit agency or your MPO feel like applying for those dollars. And if they don't, they're just not even going to get them at all. And so we have this weird combination of locking away good dollars and just handing out dollars as of right, and having all of this subject to a political process. And the end result of it is basically like, I mean, you guys at Transportation for America, Beth, are doing some of the best research on this. The vaunted IIJA or BIL, bipartisan infrastructure law, whatever you want to call it, something that was talked about as something that was climate forward is looking like it's going to be a climate net negative when you get right down to it, right? Because of the way that the dollars are structured and how the states end up spending them. You end up We put a historic infusion of dollars into transportation, and unfortunately, most of that infusion has gone to roads, has gone to more road expansion, more highway expansion, the kinds of things I don't think people are really that excited about.
I'm really taken by how you started your answer about distributing money and building things, which does seem to be the bipartisan through line of
Right.
transportation. And I don't know if you saw the op-ed that was written in the Washington Times by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Sam Graves, but you read it and it talks about needing money and needing to shore up the trust fund. And it actually says at the end, America is a nation that builds. We need to get back to building. And that starts with legislation focused on building. I mean, that's the outcome. Just build stuff, not accomplish anything, not make transportation cheaper or easier or safer or less impactful on public health or costing less. It's just build stuff. And I think that's fundamentally the only thing that anyone agrees on, or the only thing we actually accomplish. We build stuff and we spend cash.
And I mean, I'm reminded of how many times, I mean, the bridge to nowhere concept, right? Like it is absolutely the case that we have this build baby build sort of mantra here, instead of taking a step back and saying, are we developing and thinking long range and holistically about what exactly it is we're building and whether people want it or not? Like, there are it is always fascinating to me how highway buildouts are one of the few kind of infrastructure projects that actually lower land values next to where they are built. Nobody wants to live near a highway, and when they are built, they decrease land values for the people nearby. And then for everybody else, everybody has this shared experience, right? Which is you see a sign that says, highway expansion incoming. Then you're subject to years of traffic related construction. And then it opens up and you're finally like, great, this is done. Finally, I can see the benefits of this thing. And then traffic is just as bad as it ever was. Like literally no improvements. And that is just such a common American experience. And it just begs the question, well, then why do we keep doing it? Who is this for? We're just building highways so that more people living even further out than you can clog your highway because they're trying to drive through your neighborhoods to get to the big city and the job centers. It just doesn't make sense, and yet we keep on doing it. So forget your bridges to nowhere. Like even the ones that are going somewhere, they're not really working either.
You know,
And yet we argue every single time our agencies are like, well, this is the one that's going to be the unicorn. This is the one that's going to
Right.
lower travel. It's going to improve air quality. It's going to raise values. It's going to, win, win, win. Safety benefits, congestion benefits. Yep.
Yep.
Well,
We're Lucy with the football, or they are, and we're Charlie
Yes.
Brown.
yeah, and it's amazing when I think about, because I was on Capitol Hill when we were arguing about the bridge to nowhere. And it was this big, so-called, policy argument against wasteful spending. And what no one seemed to notice was they weren't opposed to the bridge to nowhere. They were opposed to it being an earmark. If it
Yes.
was done with just formula dollars, no problem. Go
All
for
right.
it. Totally up to the state. And so there were dozens of members of Congress railing against this boondoggle that they were totally fine with if it was with formula dollars. And this is what I feel like when we get into these reform conversations, the reform is, well, just don't do it with an earmark, or, well, you're right, the regular funds aren't working, but we'll create a little program over here to do the right thing and let the big program keep doing the wrong thing. And that seems the best we can do in these reauthorizations.
One thing, Nick, if you had the magic wand, what's one thing that you would change about the federal transportation program?
I would change the 80-20 split. I would significantly, and we actually saw some positive strides in this direction during the previous administration, right? As they basically said, we're going to issue guidance that loosens some of the restrictions on two of the largest pots of money, STBG and NHPP. They basically said, all right, you can actually use it for more purposes, and we're going to, articulate that pretty clearly in our guidance. And I actually think that was helpful. Like, let's just keep going in that direction then. It the challenge that creates is, one, okay, you can create more flexibility at the federal level, and that is helpful for states that want to exercise that flexibility. So if blowing it up and starting over, or not doing it and just evolving it all to the states isn't an option, then at the very least, offering the states maximal flexibility by removing certain restrictions that are basically making these dollars sound like they're highway only, and not gating away money behind complex application processes that would be really useful for transit, active mobility, climate friendly stuff. Those would be, I guess I'm giving you two things. Those would be the two things. That begs a different question, though, because now it becomes a state-based game. If the federal government says, cool, we're going to give you a lot more flexibility, and hey, here's more money that we've no longer gated behind programs that you must apply for, then, and this is kind of the central thesis of clean rides and the advocacy work there, is then it goes to the states, and then it becomes an opportunity to get states to start doing things in better ways. And that is really about getting state DOTs to say, all right, okay, we're going to take our federal dollars and our state and local dollars, and we're going to use them in ways that actually benefit people by building the things they actually need. And I'll note, that, like, the IIJA aside, which is a pretty big influx of new cash, but this is still true. Most states, the transportation dollars they get from the feds are actually dwarfed by the state and local sources. There's actually more money that states spend every year, DOTs spend every year, that comes from state and local dollars than federal dollars. And so that sort of like asks a whole different series of questions about the use of federal dollars. But then it really says, hey, then part of the game plan here, we're going to work on transforming federal reauthorization, yes, but we can't leave the states out of this. It's got to be a holistic and comprehensive approach if you're going to actually see change happen.
Do you have a particular example or story in mind when you're talking about this problem or these problems?
I mean, yeah, I have several. I mean, from my days as an advocate to now, and it's not been that long, but let's just, I don't know, we'll use a decade. It's maybe a little bit longer than that, but let's just play with the decade framework. I cannot remember a year where I wasn't talking to New Jersey Transit, to the MTA, to Connecticut, and having an agency say to me, we're in a funding crisis. We're in a funding crisis. We have shortfalls on operation. We have shortfalls on capital, blah, 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 right? And so just like the fact that for so long, and much, much longer than I've been doing this work, agencies are constantly in the scarcity mindset. And that I just heard that in every single conversation was something that just said to me, man, we have such a broken system if they are never able to get out of that scarcity mindset. And what do people do when they're in the scarcity mindset? Well, I'll tell you what they don't do. They don't think expansively. Nobody is sitting there thinking, great, let me think about how to make this system better, how to increase operations, how I'm going to dramatically expand my footprint so that more people can take our service. Like that goes out the door. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they're at the bottom. And everybody is basically struggling to get by. So that's one story that just over years and years and years of doing this work, it's just like, oh my gosh, it's the same story constantly. And then I think the other thing is so we at Summit Foundation have been supporting a group in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Together for Brothers, which is really focused on improving outcomes for men and boys, particularly men and boys of color, and especially those who are at or near poverty in Albuquerque. And it turns out that actually one of the biggest campaigns that they've been running now has been focused on transit, which says a lot about what helps you get out of poverty and other bad situations. The ability to even access career opportunities, access education, and they're desperately trying to work with any body in government there, city, county, MPO, whatever, to apply for federal funds to look, to expand bus service. And over and over and over, their erstwhile governmental partners are saying, we don't have resources to do this. We're capacity strapped. We can't apply for these grants right now. Like, we need help. And so we're desperately trying to find like technical advisors to help them out. And it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be this complicated. It just shouldn't. So yeah, those are like the two big examples that stick out in my mind about how hard this is.
You would think, one of the stats roughly is we spend $70 billion a year in federal money on surface transportation. You would think with $70 billion a year, we could address some of these problems.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Our final question, how can we fix it?
I really, really think we need to blow up the assumptions that we all make about what federal transportation reauthorization is. And that really means starting over because the base assumptions of reauthorization are flawed. And the problem is that now so much status quo thinking has gone into that process that it is hard to unwind all of it. And when I say that, I'm talking about the fact that, you know, everybody thinks about highways first. Everybody just thinks about this as being asphalt expansion, and everything else beyond that is secondary, ancillary, or just not prioritized. It is hard to think of how we're going to fix that without a dramatically new approach to reauthorization, or let's not even call it reauthorization anymore. Let's do something different. But then the other piece of this is that whatever reform we do does need to be comprehensive. And I talked about this a little bit, but when I say comprehensive, I mean this in two ways. I mean, both, we can't stop at the federal level. We need to do the work at the federal level to reform reauthorization in meaningful ways that advance transportation systems that people actually need. But then the work goes into the states. And so we have to do the work of making sure that if DOTs are getting money that they're able to use with tremendous flexibility and very little oversight and accountability, that we actually are holding them accountable, that we actually are saying, hey, we want you to use this money not to do the things that you've consistently done over time that have produced the sort of sprawl that we have now, but let's actually use them in ways that are better and actually benefit Americans. So we have to be consistent in that way. But then comprehensiveness also means another thing, and that means sticking the fight through all the way through implementation. In my world, the funding world, there is a tendency to win the big thing. You win the big policy, you pass the big measure or whatever, and then everybody says, great, we did good work. We can tell everybody we did amazing work, and now we're going to go on to the next fight. And it's exactly that problem that, okay, we did it, and we're going on to the next fight, that leads us to constantly have to come back and relitigate the stuff that we thought we had won. Right now, we're dealing with this all over the place, with even in blue trifecta states with advanced clean cars 2 and advanced clean trucks, where great, we won the policy. Cool, we did it. Well, now all of those states are starting to question the merits of the policy because we hadn't stuck the landing on implementation. Where we did stick the landing on implementation is congestion pricing. People stayed in that fight, and that's why it's alive today, even though we have a president who's trying to kill it. And so, like, that's the lesson here. We've got to stick the implementation landing because you know who stays in those rooms after the bill is passed or the policy is signed? It's the people who have money at stake here. So you're talking about like all of the folks who love the status quo, who just want to keep building the way we've always built. And when we're not in those rooms too, they win. End of story. And that's a huge part of our problem.
That's exactly right. I kind of out of left field question for you. You talk about blowing up the program. I talk about blowing up the program, or frankly, just letting it fall under its own weight. I really can't figure out how those that support the status quo or the folks on Capitol Hill prevent the trust fund from failing. I can't describe the story that gets us there.
Yeah.
Why do you think so many people now are jumping onto this? I'm surprised at how many people I say, just let the program fail, that go, maybe so, including members of Congress, mayors, real activists. I've never seen anything like it before. I'm curious what you think has led to so many people just giving up on this whole approach.
So this is so interesting because I said something similar earlier today, and I'm gonna take us in a slightly political direction. So reel me in if this isn't where we're going here. But like, I was having a conversation with some folks in New York earlier today about Zoran Mamdani, and I basically was like, look, um, Mamdani and Trump are opposite sides of the exact same coin, which is basically that in moments of precarity, when we see that systems are failing and they're not working for us, we look for radical alternatives. The reason that status quo politicians, your boring staid folks, are finding themselves challenged on the right and the left is because the existing system doesn't work. And that's true in all kinds of political arenas right now, and transportation is literally no exception. We have had a system that is doing things that aren't meeting the needs of Americans, right? We can't afford homes. And when we can't afford a home, we're affording a home that's 2 hours away from job centers, has nothing nearby, and my family lives hours away too. And so I'm now stuck in this like horrible anomie of a cookie cutter home that looks like every other cookie cutter home and nothing to do and nobody that I know. And I guess I have a 2 hour commute every day, right? The system isn't working. And so when people are basically saying blow it up, it's because we know that sticking with it isn't serving anybody anymore. And so radical alternatives actually look quite appealing. And I think like that's the whole thing. That is a
Yeah,
story of American politics right now.
My
that's a
question
really
is
good point.
if we blow it up or let it fall apart, die under its own weight, what comes out of the ashes?
It's a great question. But I can't write the script where it's worse.
There are people out there with terrible imaginations that maybe are greater than ours. But I agree, if it fell apart under its own weight, I have a hard time seeing a worse set of outcomes than what we already have for most people. Like people are really struggling. Transportation is the second largest expense after housing, and housing costs are intrinsically tied to transportation costs. These two things are a circle. The two biggest expenses Americans face are all tied to the issue that we're discussing, and
And
everybody is struggling.
I'd argue the number one thing standing in the way of us building housing is transportation, because
Absolutely.
we'd rather keep housing rare. Um, because the alternative is there might be a little bit of traffic at the corner or there might not be enough parking. So let's just not house people.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just it's such a disaster in so many ways. How much faith can you put in this? Mm.
It really is. And there are good examples of where it works, and we need to like double down on those examples. We talk about density and people conjure Manhattan. It doesn't have to look like Manhattan. It actually can look like Main Street, and people forget that density is, having a lovely street with shops and buses and a bike lane and parking and 3 or 4 stories of housing that
Yep.
hold the people who keep those shops in business. And that's density, and that's beautiful. People love that stuff, and we just need more of it in America. And unfortunately, the way that we've designed our systems, we have a hard time doing that.
Well, and part of this flexibility conversation, I think leads me to thinking about how can you actually use transportation dollars to incentivize housing, denser development. And we're surprisingly maybe not surprisingly, we're not very good at that, at
No.
actually investing our billions of transportation dollars in ways that are building the communities that a lot of folks want to live in, and reducing that dependence on always having to drive. Because there's a lot of people across this country who have zero alternatives because
Yep.
of the way we have built our systems, because we have chosen to spend our money.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have lots of people who can't drive and, need options and need to be able to live lives with dignity. And getting
30,
around is a really important part of that.
30% of our population. Okay, Nick, we're going to ask you the bonus question.
Okay.
Nick,
Given that
phone.
this is complicated, how should foundations funders be thinking about the upcoming reauthorization?
So back in 2008, back in 2008, funders were actually much more engaged in the transportation fight. Um, and then there was a pretty significant drop off after that. And on the advocacy side, when I was raising money as a deputy director and then an executive director, I was constantly feeling like I was tilting at windmills, trying to convince people that we should put money into improving our transportation infrastructure, whether it was uh, arguing that, hey, this is a racial justice issue, or arguing that this is an economic justice issue. Like I said, the second largest expense people face and clearly tied to the first, or that it was a climate issue. This is now the single largest sector producing emissions that we haven't even touched. We haven't made a dent in transportation, and yet it's 30% of our emissions in the U.S. So it's extraordinarily frustrating to see all of these ways that transportation play into progressive goals, and all these ways that transportation are contributing to a worsening of society. And yet foundations aren't saying we need to be here en masse. And so I would argue that reauthorization is our once every 5 years ish, as Beth knows full well, opportunity to make a big swing, and we should take it. But then the other thing is that we need to also stay in the fight beyond those 5 years, because again, it's the implementation fight. If we're not in it to win it and we're not there consistently, then it's just not going to happen. And I think a lot of funders think, oh, well, I can't change transportation. It's just, how do we do it? There's 1.1 billion daily trips every day. How am I going to influence people's decisions? It's like, no, you know what? When we transformed the power sector, which we're not done with, but have made huge strides in, we didn't tell people to stop turning on their lights. We shut down the coal plants. We went upstream. And in the same way with transportation, you don't have to tell people not to take that trip. You go upstream. You change the way DOTs do their business from the federal level to the state level. And if you change the permission structures, you give people more options to get around. You make it more likely that they don't have to get around. You can walk to destinations rather than have to drive. Suddenly, you don't need to tell people not to turn on their lights. They're going to love all of the different things that they can do. We just need to do more of that. And it really takes foundations saying, great, we're going to put money into advocacy to make it happen.
I love that. And I will just add that in transportation, small changes have profound effects. Here in Washington, D.C., we love to talk about how all the traffic congestion goes away in August when Congress goes into recess. But what people don't realize is the traffic loads only go down about 3%. That's all. That's the whole difference. So we're not talking about radical change in a lot of these cases. Even minor changes have profound impacts on quality of life, on expenses, on availability of affordable homes by, reducing the parking minimums by a little bit. Every little bit has a profound impact. And I find that empowering. I hope others do too. Well, Nick, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experience. Where can people find you and more information about the work you are doing at the Summit Foundation?
So people can find me at Summit Foundation, and they can reach out to me. I love talking with folks who care about this issue and want to find ways to get involved. I'm available at my email, nsifuentes@summitfdn.org.
Woo. And Clean Rides has a website. You can learn all about the Clean Rides Network work as well.
At cleanridesnetwork.org.
Incredible. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
So that was fun. Nick, it's neat when folks have experience in the advocacy side and the foundation side and are thinking about how to weave those pieces together, those communities together. He's an asset.
Yeah, and he has seen this at all levels. Even small wins we get at the federal level turn into an additional fight in, 52 state DOTs when you include Puerto Rico and DC. And just recognizing how you do have to follow that all the way to ground to really make change is a super important thing to know, and really helpful, I think, for all of us that someone in philanthropy has experienced that and really knows it.
I had a friend who worked at an agency who complained that in transportation, there's so many decision points, that there's too many decision points.
Yeah.
And realize like that's the map of our advocacy landscape is where all those decision points. So we have folks working locally to get a bike lane on a street and get a sidewalk built, folks working for transit funding at an agency level, at state legislative levels, at state DOT levels. And it's almost like just accepting and understanding that the landscape is broad and we have people working at all those places across the landscape. And we need to continue to support and encourage their work. And the federal stuff is exciting and appealing because it's a chance to make a big impact. But we need to continue to work all the way down that chain.
Absolutely right. Well, let's dive into our fact of the day. This one I think is very relevant to not just what we're talking about, but my organization's experience. One of the first major American philanthropic investments in bicycle and pedestrian advocacy came from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the early 2000s as part of its push to combat obesity by promoting active living. It was called Active Living by Design, which was kicked off in 2001, and it was an effort that emphasized how urban design and transportation systems affect physical activity. The initiative sparked a wave of nonprofit advocacy in these spaces, including things like Complete Streets, that's still paying off today, and really paved the way for a bunch of other major funders to participate, like the Kresge Foundation, CERDNA, Transit Center, the Rockefeller Foundation, whose funding started Transportation for America, and to make those transportation issues about more than just moving around, but health, equity, and climate. And actually, there is a study that was published in the National Journal of Preventive Medicine that evaluated active living by design, which had community cohorts, and found that these partnerships implemented a larger number of active living promotions, programs, and policies. So sometimes it takes a while for you to see how it pays off, but a study of almost a decade of work showed that the communities invested in by philanthropy actually implemented more positive transportation projects. And the Summit Foundation joined the work in the early 2010s, and they've also been a very important funder of work of my organization, Transit Center, Shared Use Mobility Center, and other organizations that are key to this work.
All right. So the wheels of transportation keep rolling, and so do we. Catch you next time.
Catch you then.